September 6th, 1901. Buffalo, New York is hosting the World's Fair. In more ways than one, this World's Fair showed a snapshot of America at a crossroad. The centerpiece was a display demonstrating the wonders of electrification. Other exhibits featured the majesty of American technology and industry, machines, mines, and agriculture. And visiting this fair on this day was none other than the head of America himself, President William McKinley. He was immensely popular, seeing America through a successful war against the Spanish, the expansion of their territorial holdings, and a massive economic boom from the Second Industrial Revolution. He had just been elected for a second term, and it seemed impossible anyone could dislike such a successful leader. When meeting the public, McKinley liked to show he was a man of the people. He'd shake hands and greet citizens, often to the protestation of his security detail. The meeting with the public took place at the Temple of Music, a beautiful concert hall. While he was shaking hands, he met a young man in his 20s who appeared to have an injured hand, or at least it was covered in bandages. As McKinley held out his hand to shake, the young man slapped it away, raised his bandaged hand, and fired. Concealed under the bandage was a pistol. A first shot grazed the president, but the second embedded itself in his abdomen. Over the next 8 days, McKinley rested in a hospital bed until the infected wound took his life on September 14th. In that moment, the assassin, a 28-year-old steelworker by the name of Leon Czolgosz, became the face of evil to the nation. His background, his political beliefs, and his sanity would all come under scrutiny by a nation in shock. The following month, on October 29th, 1901, he'd suffer 3 jolts of 1,800 volts from the electric chair, ending his life. What followed the death of President McKinley was a xenophobic panic, sometimes described as a historical war on terror that went to shape American political culture forever. Today, I want to talk about this flashpoint in US history. What would motivate a man like Czolgosz to murder such a popular president? What was the difference between his America and the one McKinley represented? What impact would this have on the United States? And what lessons should we heed today? Hi, I'm Tristan from Step Back History. America was at a strange crossroads of its life in 1901. It was going from a relatively local power to an international big player. On top of that, the Second Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and America was changing in big ways. And the traditional ways of managing the United States weren't really handling the changes very well. As a result, the United States, at the time of McKinley's assassination, was at this point between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And the world that William McKinley lived in, one of prosperity, glory, colonial conquest, was at odds with the life of Leon Czolgosz, of poverty, of alienation, displacement. And so I think when we're going to talk about the McKinley assassination, we have to begin with the era that it happened in. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in these two different periods as we periodize American history right around the time this happened. So let's begin a little bit with the Gilded Age. This was a period of essentially unregulated capitalism. The reigning ideology of the day was classical liberalism, which basically afforded for many of the liberties, i.e. the right to work where you see fit, live where you see fit. Those were important, but material conditions, things like whether or not you could afford to live wherever you wanted, or afford to eat food, or afford to send your kids to school rather than a coal mine, those were not rights they guaranteed. And the Progressive Era, which is we're going to talk about a little bit later, is the backlash against that, where they decide to make great reforms. But because of classical liberalism's dedication to no regulations, America had the highest rate of industrial accidents in the world at this point. Let's just give one example of classical liberalism's dedication to free markets and lack of regulation leading to negative side effects. In 1889, there were about 700,000 people employed in the railroad industry, and of those 700,000 people, 20,000 of them in 1889 alone were injured on the job. as well, almost 2,000 people died. The United States was the only industrialized country that had no workmen's compensation program. So if you got injured on the job, you just lost your job. There was no money, there was nothing to help you land on your feet, nothing at all. For the believers in classical liberalism, though, everything was working out great. Literally grinding up the bodies of the working class in the gears of industrial capitalism was making them tons and tons of money. The US economy was growing at the fastest rate it had and will ever grow in this period. And because of the introduction of wage labor, in which nobody actually had control over the factories except for factory owners, so they just made a set amount of money every day, a lot of that wealth just went straight to the top. And this period in American history had the second highest level of income inequality in all of American history. I say second because the top period of inequality in American history is now. To give you an idea about how unequal America was, the top 1% of Americans owned about a third of all of America's wealth. The top 10% owned about 3/4 of America's wealth, and the bottom 40% had no wealth at all. The wealthiest 1% in America also owned about 51% of all of the land that was available for private purchase in America, and the bottom 44% had about 1.1%. So you can imagine that there were a lot of people who were unhappy with the state of affairs. People didn't really like the idea of a small contingent becoming vastly wealthy by literally killing them and their children in these big, ugly factories that are making them sick, and all in the service of giving them subsistence wages, you know, an amount that they take home that they can barely survive on, them and their spouse and their 27 children, all brought home like almost just enough to pay rent and eat food. And that's working 6 days a week and usually 12 to 14-hour days. There's a reason that I often say to people that this is a definite step downward for the working class compared to feudalism. In response, we have what's called the entirety of the labor movement. We had the development of trade unions where workers who worked for wages would all come together to exert political power themselves to try and get concessions, you know, better working conditions out of their bosses, because together they had the ability to withhold labor and strike. And it would work. Sometimes they would get concessions. That's kind of the story of the progressive era. But other times, their bosses would simply hire Irish mercenaries to literally kill them. Through groups like the Pinkertons, American labor history is some of the most violent labor history in all the world, I believe. But I don't want to get distracted because that is very much another video. Maybe you should leave a comment down there if you want me to rant about labor history for half an hour or so. In 1901, that period of inequality and class violence and conflict was starting to change ever so slightly. Movements on the ground to make things better were starting to get more powerful, but the political entrenched elite were not quite on board yet. The first president who would be openly on board with a lot of these progressive issues would be McKinley's successor, Theodore Roosevelt. What was happening is stuff like muckraking, which is a type of journalism where journalists would embed themselves within different workplaces and write about all the horrors and stuff going on. Famous journalists like Upton Sinclair would write books exposing the horrible underbelly of how factories work. Some of the most famous examples I can remember is extensive writing about how poorly handled meat was in Chicago and how really unsanitary the conditions were, as well as people working in pickling plants where the exposure to acid and the constant injuries from the knives just were so commonplace that a lot of the people working there had their thumbs just ground down to a nub. Not only were they exposing the horrors of industrial capitalism, but they also were exposing corruption in American politics. And if there's one thing you could say about late 19th century American politics is that it was extremely corrupt. This is the period of Tammany Hall. This is the period of political machines. This is just a period where, you know, if you didn't have lots of money to grease the wheels of politics, you basically couldn't get anywhere. And so really, it was awful, it was corrupt, it was almost exactly like right now. Some of the richest families in America, like the Rockefellers, for example, realized that the pitchforks were coming for them, and so they started to shell out lots of money to philanthropic projects in order to sort of assate the masses. If you wonder why so many things are named after like Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, it's because of this period. And the Union started to get victories. This is why Saturday is part of the weekend. This is why you don't work 16-hour days, you work 8-hour days. It's also why children don't work in coal mines. And all these strikes and all these victories were won with blood. I just want everybody to know, I know that we're circling back on labor history right now, but I just want everybody to know, especially the people who think that unions are bad, that unions are the reason that you have things like Saturdays. They're the reason that your children are not working in coal mines. And they did so with their blood. People literally died for these things. And people who are against unions should show some goddamn respect. Labor Day is not about soldiers, it's about workers. You also saw the rise of prominent civil rights movements like the women's suffrage movement. Despite all of the white supremacist overtones that existed within the suffragette movement, it would lead to women getting the vote about 18 years after the assassination of William McKinley. And that sort of says that a lot of the real dreams of the progressive movement would not happen until after 1901. Another side effect of this era being ruled by classical liberalism is that the economy had no safeguards on it, which meant that it was a completely free and unregulated capitalist economy. This is the dream the libertarians wanted. Everything was on the gold standard. It was, like I said, their dream. And because it was completely unregulated, that meant that the economy was much more unstable. One of the things that affected Leon Czolgosz and contributed to a lot of the political instability in America at this time was a huge economic downturn that happened called the Panic of 1893. I don't think I need to go into too much detail, but there was a run on the banks that was caused by some real issues within commodities markets internationally, especially in Argentina. And America at the time relied on cheap commodity prices in order to feed the industrial beast. And that led to a huge economic downturn. This led to a peak of 20% unemployment by the end of 1893, and essentially America entered into another cool zone in which radical politics started to be on the rise, and people started losing faith in the government. One example of the radicalization of American politics in this period was the rise of the People's Party, a populist left-wing party focused on agrarian issues, and also movements like the Free Silver movement, which was basically about detaching the American dollar from the gold standard to allow for the government to print money in order to deal with financial crises. Because to a certain degree, inflation is actually good for people who have debts. If the money becomes worth less, then your debt becomes smaller. And so farmers and people in debt actually were trying to expand the money supply by attaching money to silver as well as gold so that they could, pay their debts and live, which they loved, but bankers didn't. And because there were no safeguards on the economy, this led to a negative feedback loop. And even by 1901, when America was still booming again, working class had never really recovered. But what it did do is radicalize them and start more huge strikes and huge movements to push for a more explicitly left-wing agenda in American politics, which hadn't happened before. It was happening in Europe, but it hadn't come across the Atlantic yet. And in this period, America is experiencing higher European immigration, and they brought over with them ideas from the continent that were about, socialism and Marxism, but importantly for this story, anarchism. And if we're going to understand Leon Czolgosz, we're going to need to understand anarchism, because he was an anarchist. I just want to make a bit of a disclaimer before we move forward and talk about anarchism that I'm an anarchist, and so, I just want to air that out a little bit. I tried to be fair, so yeah, don't at me, bro. So for the completely uninitiated, what is anarchism? Now, there are thousands of YouTube videos on this topic now, it seems, but I'll give a little brief description. It's a political philosophy that's focused on being against hierarchies. The main principle of anarchism, beyond all other things that you've heard, is that hierarchy has a burden of proof, i.e., if a hierarchical human structure exists, we should interrogate it, see if that hierarchy is really necessary, and if it isn't, we should try to replace it with horizontally organized voluntary organizations. That's like the core of anarchism, and many anarchists have come to the conclusion that the state, as it exists, a monolithic, singular organization that you join because you were born there, and that have the army and the police and stuff, is not necessary for the benefit of all humanity. And that we could organize society perfectly fine without one. How you do that, what that society looks like, is the reason we have a whole rainbow of different anarchist tendencies, and many of them squabble all the time about different things. Now, in 1901, anarchist thought in America had been in the intellectual zeitgeist for almost a century, and there are some uniquely American aspects of anarchist thought that do play into the sort of concept that anarchists have of themselves today. There were two major strains of thought in American anarchism, that being anarcho-communism and individualist anarchism. Anarcho-communism was this mix of anarchist thought and communist thought that was becoming more popular in Europe at the time. Its intellectual fathers were both Russian, Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, and seeing anarcho-communist and leftist movements in this period was not an uncommon sight, especially amongst Eastern European immigrants. And in this period, that also meant a lot of Jewish Americans who had escaped pogroms in Russia. Gosh, what reason could Jewish people have to be against state authority? Because the internet is impervious to sarcasm, the reason why so many Jews became interested in anarchism is because they kept coming from countries where the state was trying to kill them. Now, the second strain of anarchism, individualist anarchism, is more of an intellectual tradition that is uniquely American. And a lot of its founding intellectuals were Americans too. And it focuses heavily on the protection of the individual against the state's imposition of authority over yourself. So individualist anarchists focused more on freedoms for them to live their lives as they saw fit. So this is more things like free love, LGBTQ plus causes, anarcho-feminism, and just general freedom and free thought. And I don't want to set up any false dichotomies. Both of them were pretty firmly entrenched in the political left, and there was a lot of crossover. Emma Goldman, an anarcho-communist, was also very into anarcho-feminism and free love, for example. We'll be talking about her in September. But it is interesting to know that individualist anarchist writings do have some legacy in the American right. The reactionary pro-segregation political movement known as libertarianism in America has its roots traced a little bit intellectually to some individualist anarchist writers. You just sprinkle in some neoliberalism, some reactionary politics, and anti-civil rights sentiments, and you just kind of get that all together, and that's basically what the modern capital L libertarian movement is in American politics. Also, I wouldn't be able to get away without talking a little bit about syndicalism and anarcho-syndicalism, which is a movement that takes anarchism and bakes it deeply into the labor movement. It was a common idea that one of the ways that society could run without a government is if all the functions of society were managed by the labor unions of the people who were doing the jobs of the world. And, America is the land of the IWW, so anarcho-syndicalism has a pretty special place in the heart of American leftist politics. All right, we're almost at Leon Czolgosz, I swear. But the next thing that we need to talk about, now that we've kind of given you an idea of what anarchism is, we need to talk about a sort of tactic that was gaining popularity amongst anarchists at the time, and that is propaganda of the deed. So a lot of anarchists believed that society's inequalities were mounting so high, that people were so repressed, that there was this simmering stew of working class resentment against the state and against capitalist authority, but that they were complacent and that they needed something, kind of like how a cloud needs a grain of dust in order to form, that there needs to be some sort of flashpoint to create the spontaneous uprising against the state. And propaganda of the deed is typically that idea made manifest. So anarchists believe that if you were to commit an act of violence, say kill a very unpopular and tyrannical king, or a boss who's oppressing his workers, or a president of the United States, that it would set off a chain reaction that would make that spontaneous workers' revolution start to rise up against the state. So at times of heightened repression from capitalist and state authorities, having a assassination of a figure that is highly reviled by the citizens and seeing the massive backlash of repression that would cause would sort of set everything off. And this had happened in several cases in Europe, most famously the King of Italy. And propaganda of the deed is what Leon Czolgosz thought he was doing. All right, now we can talk about Leon Czolgosz. He was born in 1873 to Polish-American parents in Michigan. As a child, he was reportedly socially awkward and bullied by other kids. And eventually he grew up, though, and he got some work at a rolling mill company. And when the Panic of 1893 happened, his company tried to lower everybody's wages. There was a strike, and that strike seems to have awoken the leftist tendencies within Czolgosz. He reportedly became disaffected with the world and found no comfort within the traditional places that somebody in the Polish immigrant community would go to, such as like the church or something like that. And he found his solace amongst a workingmen's group, a socialist workingmen's group. But even within this group, he quickly found himself too radical for its membership and was looking for a more and more radical politics to become associated with. His awakening into anarchism seems to have happened not long before he decided to commit an assassination in the name of his political beliefs. In May of 1901, he saw a speech by Emma Goldman and was enthralled. He tried to speak with her in July briefly to get her to introduce him to other anarchists and to sort of get more involved in anarchist organization in America. But he was very socially awkward, and all of the people he talked to try to get into these anarchist societies were a little put off by him constantly talking about wanting to do violence and, just openly asking where the secret society where we plan anarchist violence is. His interaction with other anarchists were so bad that the radical newspaper Free Society published a bulletin warning people about him.
Attention! The attention of the comrades is called to another spy. He is well dressed, of medium height, rather narrow shoulders, blond, and about 25 years of age. After the present, he has made his appearance in Chicago and in Cleveland. In the former place he remained but a short time, while in Cleveland he disappeared when the comrades had confirmed themselves of his identity and were on the point of exposing him. His demeanor is of the usual sort, pretending to be greatly interested in the cause, asking for names, soliciting aid for acts of contemplated violence. If the same individual makes his appearance elsewhere, the comrades are warned in advance and can act accordingly.
So it seems that the anarchist community at the time thought he was probably a cop or something and actively rejected him. He was #canceled, if you will. So Czolgosz became a lone wolf anarchist, and he became aware of the assassination of Umberto I, who was that king of Italy I mentioned who was killed by an anarchist, and decided that he wanted to do one of those. So without a social network to stop him before he could go too far, he started to plot the assassination of President William McKinley. So about a month before the World's Fair, he traveled to Buffalo and got himself a hotel that was close by, and he bought himself a .32 caliber Iver Johnson safety automatic revolver. Now, against the wishes of his security personnel, McKinley decided to go and shake hands with the people, and Czolgosz got himself in line. He disguised his gun under his palm, pretending that his hand was injured, so he had some bandages underneath. So he waited and waited in line, and when McKinley finally was going to shake his hand, he put his hand out. Czolgosz smacked his hand away and fired twice into his stomach at point-blank range. One only grazed him, but the second one embedded itself, and he died of infection 8 days later. When McKinley finally died from gangrene, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, was sworn into office and vowed to come down hard on Czolgosz as a way to set an example and to suppress anarchist organization in America. Czolgosz himself was interrogated, and in his interrogation, he said that he was inspired by Emma Goldman, so they tried to arrest Emma Goldman by arresting her family, and she eventually spent 3 months in jail and was let loose with no charges because she had nothing to do with this assassination. He also refused to speak with his lawyers, who tried to defend him in the grand jury he was put in front of. His legal defense tried to argue that Czolgosz was insane. He went and shot the president in the middle of a big public place where there was no way he could have escaped, which doesn't sound like the most sane thing to do now, is it? And despite getting the jury to agree that he was probably insane, they decided to execute him anyway. He was indicted and sentenced to the electric chair. On the night of his execution, he met with his brother and insisted that there be no religion or no clergy dealing with his death or his funeral or anything like that. He didn't want anything to do with religion. He turned away any priests who came to speak with him. And right before he was put in the electric chair, these were his words.
I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. I'm not sorry for my crime. I'm sorry I could not see my father.
On October 29th, 1901, from 3 electric shocks, Leon Czolgosz was killed. After a brief autopsy, his body was buried on the prison grounds, and acid was poured on his corpse so that it would quickly dissolve within a few hours. They wanted to leave no marker behind. They wanted there to be no place for people to go. And they even destroyed a lot of his personal effects. So there's no way they could make any sort of shrine to him or anything like that. They wanted to make sure that Czolgosz could not become a martyr. Now, as I mentioned, during the trial, there was an attempt to make an insanity plea. And they did try to test his mental health, but in a very 1901 way, where during his autopsy, they measured his brain to see if it had the proper lumps and things like that. So it wasn't that useful. And so the question of whether Czolgosz was mentally healthy does kind of loom over the entire thing. Now, a therapist can't diagnose anybody with mental illness without speaking with them, so obviously we can't say that Czolgosz was mentally ill. But there is enough evidence to say that there wasn't nothing. He was very socially awkward. He did choose to kill the president in the middle of a crowd where there was no way he could escape. And both those things do imply that, possibly something was going on. Now, besides Czolgosz, the response to McKinley's assassination was a very sharp criticism of the president's security detail. His security detail was made up of 3 different organizations who didn't communicate very well with each other, and the whole security system around the president was very problematic in general. This is the 3rd president to be assassinated, and he was the 25th president. And so, informally, by 1902, Theodore Roosevelt was being protected 24/7 by the Secret Service, which is a organization developed by Abraham Lincoln on the day he was assassinated, interestingly, that is actually a part of the US Treasury and was primarily focused on the task of finding and intercepting counterfeit money. After much debate, Congress decided that there should be a 24/7 protection detail on the president, and out of all the organizations they could have picked, they decided to stick with the Secret Service. And this was quite a big thing. There was actually a lot of people in Congress who didn't want the president to have a dedicated security force, because they didn't like the idea of America centralizing power in such a way, and something about the president having a personal police force just felt a little unnerving.
Since their arrival, federal agents wearing military-style gear and sometimes driving unmarked vans have unleashed tear gas into crowds, rounded up and detained protesters, and even shot one man in the head with a non-lethal round, causing serious injury.
Keep in mind that at this time there wasn't even a federal law enforcement agency. The assassination of McKinley also started something that would be compared to the War on Terror, but against anarchists. The Buffalo police, after the assassination of William McKinley, believed that Czolgosz did not act alone. In the days following the assassination, vigilantes attacked and vandalized different anarchist organizations. Nobody was killed exactly, but a lot of anarchist organizations and publications basically lost everything, and a lot of them never recovered. Anarchists around the country were subject to a massive surveillance investigation. This investigation would eventually be consolidated into what would become the FBI. Americans already had a negative view of anarchists because of the Haymarket Massacre, which is unfair, but that was not the perception at the time. If you want to learn more about the Haymarket Massacre, I'll put a link to Thoughtline's video on it because it's really good. Congress also passed a law which put a ban on anarchist activism, which they didn't use until the First World War, until it was used to arrest and deport a whole bunch of anarchist immigrants in the United States, including Emma Goldman in 1919. And let's not forget that when that happened, it was primarily focused on Jewish people, and they were capturing Jewish people and sending them back to the country that they fled because of all of the oppression that they were receiving. And even though Leon Czolgosz was born in America, his last name was Czolgosz, which means he didn't have that same John Wilkes Booth energy of being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So America, which is always looking for a xenophobic moral panic, decided to say that this was the work of immigrants.
Immigrants, I knew it was them!
He was a child of Polish immigrants. The perception was largely that anarchists were this foreign invading ideology, and so they needed to prevent the immigrants from coming in and spreading their anarchism. So they passed the 1903 Immigration Act, which allowed for the banning of people from entering the country or the expulsion of people from the country if they expressed anarchist beliefs. That was the first law since the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act that allowed for the government to restrict people's immigration based on political beliefs. And I'm sure it's no surprise that a lot of people today have compared this period with the War on Terror. A single act of terrorism used to excuse a whole range of xenophobia, and even by the current president, an excuse to ban an entire belief system from coming into the country. And you have both presidential candidates being on the record saying that they want people to go to prison for having a different political belief than them. So much for the tolerant right. And it comes off as weird, but now you know that it has roots in American history. Hey everybody, I don't have a sponsor for this month's video, but I do want to draw some attention to the YouTube channel that I started this month, Tristan Won't Shut Up. It's my attempt to make content every week and make content about stuff that doesn't necessarily have to be constrained by the topic of history. There are already 2 videos up and a third one should be up soon if it's not already, on the coronavirus and the United States, and a expert-run tabletop simulation of the 2020 election that shows some pretty messed up outcomes that could come out of what happens in November. And the third one's going to be on Paradox games. And while I enjoy them very, very much, there are some very problematic assumptions baked into the code. Today, the Panic of 1893 and the movements which arose from it have a lot to teach us about the moment we're in now. The growing inequality since the 1970s, exacerbated by the crash of 2008 and the economic meltdown brought by the pandemic, is a recipe for political instability. These moments, where the contradictions in our economy result in a tiny elite not even noticing the suffering masses, can lead to moments where Vladimir Lenin would say, decades happen in weeks. Welcome to what historians refer to as the cool zone. Hey everybody, I want to thank Jareth from 12 Tone and Trey the Explainer for providing voiceovers for this video. And if you don't want to miss next month's video on Emma Goldman, you should subscribe and hit the bell notification. Thank you my patrons for making this possible. Check out Tristan Won't Shut Up, and I'll see you all next time for more Step Back.